In this lecture, Christian Practices. A significant 20th century development in Christianity has been the ecumenical movement. This is a loosely organized movement that aims for cooperation between different Christian groups and emphasizes what different Christian groups have in common, and even dream that someday Christian groups might be reunited, such as Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. In the past, at many times, different groups of Christians had condemned one another and competed against one another. And this is a reaction against that. Hey, aren't we all Christians? Can't we all work together? Can't we learn to even live with our theological and practical differences? Another change, starting in the 20th century, involves stances towards other religions. And this is in response to a lot of thinking caused by increased exposure to, dialogue with, and sympathy with members of other religions. It was at first missionaries who started asking questions about the traditional Christian stance towards other religions. Nowadays, that stance is often called exclusivism. The slogan of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was, quote, "Outside the Church there is no salvation," end quote. Either you're a Catholic in good standing, or you're going to hell. That has seemed too restrictive to many people, not least because a number of people are held up in the Jewish Bible as good people, such as David or Abraham or Moses, and surely those people were not Christians. An extreme reaction to this is an outlook often called religious pluralism. This is the view that many religions, maybe even all the great world religions or most religions, at least once we exclude things like Satanism, many religions are equally effective ways to obtain the goal of religion, in Christianity, salvation. A Christian pluralist, and of course you might be a pluralist and be a Jew or Muslim or Buddhist, etc., Christian pluralists would say that one might as well gain salvation by practicing Islam, or by practicing Judaism, or by practicing Hinduism. But probably to most Christians, this doesn't seem compatible with the uniqueness of Christ as taught in the Bible. A middle position is called inclusivism. This holds that the goal of religion can be obtained through more than one tradition. This view has become very popular among educated Roman Catholics and among educated Protestants in recent times. In some sense, one can be saved through Christ without having ever heard of him. One famous Catholic theologian, Karl Rahner, even talks about anonymous Christians. These are people who respond the right way in repentance to God and are Christians without knowing it, because they're being saved through Christ without knowing it. This terminology has been offensive to some people in other religions. What's the status of women in the Christian tradition? The position in the New Testament is fairly clear. First, women are equal in value to men. It's not the case that one is better than the other. And this is even on a spiritual level. Yet, on the face of it, the New Testament requires church leadership and family leadership to be male. As in traditional Judaism, there's assumed to be a difference in role between men and women and between husbands and wives, which is sort of built into God's creation. Thus, in one place, Paul says, "But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ." Husband and wife then fit into a universe where there are hierarchies of leadership or headship. Still, the New Testament doesn't sanction that a man should abuse or dominate his wife. It says that he has to love her as much as he loves himself. This, with very few exceptions, has been the traditional practice and the traditional understanding of Christianity. But since World War II, at least in the Western world, due to the influence of the feminist movement, passages in the Bible that seem to require male leadership in a church context and between husbands and wives have been either ignored or reinterpreted in more egalitarian ways. What then is the Christian outlook on human sexuality? When I look at the Christian tradition, I don't see any one outlook on human sexuality. I see three broad families of views. The first outlook is one we could call Judaic or biblical. In this way of thinking, sex is part of God's creation, and God's creation is good, so sex in general is a good thing. And as we've seen a couple times before in Genesis, men and women are created in God's image. They're both like God, and God is like them. And God is not literally male, nor is God literally female, but both male and female are like God in different ways. Sexual pleasure, at least in the context of marriage, is not something to be lamented, but something to be gratefully enjoyed. The norm, and of course this is not for everybody, but the norm for the human race is monogamistic marriage. English scholar Geoffrey Parinder observes, quote, "Every religion has some distinctive characteristics, and Christianity is the only major religion which from the outset has seemed to insist upon monogamy." End quote. And not just any marriage, but a companionate marriage. A marriage where the husband and wife are friends to one another. Paul says in one place that husband and wife should, quote, "submit to one another," end quote. By that he means to yield to the other one's preferences, to have consideration for the other. A second outlook in the Christian tradition I would call the Hellenized outlook, that is, Greekized. This is an outlook heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, and specifically by the views of Plato and Aristotle. In fact, most of the schools of ancient Greek philosophy were down on sex and on women and on marriage in general in different ways. And through multiple streams of influence, an anti-woman and anti-sex view played a big role in Christian thinking about sexuality, especially in the Roman Catholic tradition. And I should tell you that because of this influence, a lot of people misread Paul as having this type of outlook. Paul is always difficult to understand, and it's tricky to interpret what he says on the subject of sex. But I view Paul as firmly in the first camp, as holding an essentially Jewish view about human sexuality. Back to this view, then. One aspect of the Hellenized view is glorification of celibacy. Celibacy is better and it's holier than a life of marriage. You could say that celibacy is voluntary asexuality. It's not that the celibate person doesn't have sexual desire, but they decide to say no to it systematically. They don't cultivate that desire and they don't act on it, or at least that's the intention. Christians in this tradition have even come up with the concept of a Josephite marriage. This is a celibate marriage, a marriage where husband and wife do not sexually interact. Since they decided that Mary was a perpetual virgin, and yet she was married to Joseph, well, they must have had a sexless marriage. Josephite marriage is viewed as a better and more spiritual kind of marriage. There have been times when Roman Catholic couples have taken vows of celibacy and continued to live together, but ceased marital relations. Another idea in this tradition, which is kind of shocking, and it goes back to Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, is the idea that females result from some kind of mistake in fetal development, so that females are imperfect males. That is, in the process of fetal development, if everything goes correctly, you get a male. And if something goes wrong, you get a female. This is what Aristotle speculated, and it's a view that was picked up by many Christian thinkers in the Middle Ages. Other Greek ideas they picked up about women are that women are less reasonable, they're less self-controlled than men are, and they're less suitable for friendship. Some of the Greeks thought that the best kind of friendship could only be realized between two men, required a meeting of minds, required two fully reasonable beings. Another view, and they don't always put it that way, but this is basically what they think. Many of them thought that sexual pleasure is a necessary evil. It's part of the design plan. It's not something that can be avoided, unfortunately, but in itself it's not good. Some of them even speculated that before the fall of Adam and Eve, human beings reproduced asexually. Don't ask me how that would work. According to medieval theologians, motives for engaging in sex, and we're talking about sex between husband and wife, the motives are all important. There was a fourfold distinction that was widely recognized, and this is well summarized by the Catholic theologian Uta Ranke Heinemann. She says, quote, "Theologians had gradually settled on four main motives. 1. Intercourse for procreation. 2. Intercourse to perform one's duty. These two alone considered sinless by Augustine. 3. Intercourse because of incontinence, held to be sinless by some, but viewed by most as a venial sin, that is, a less serious sin. And 4. Intercourse to satisfy one's lust, considered mortally sinful by most." End quote. The medieval view was then that to have sex for the sake of having offspring is good. It's also sinless to have sex simply because it's one's duty as a spouse. And it's either permissible or a very minor sin to have sex so that you or your spouse doesn't commit fornication. In other words, simply to prevent a greater evil. But the one thing that's wrong is intercourse to satisfy one's own desire, one's own lust. That, having sex because you're horny, is wrong. It's a sin. Another aspect of this tradition is many restrictions on married sex. There were many times that were forbidden. You weren't supposed to do it on Sunday. You weren't supposed to do it on a great many other holy days or within a certain number of days before taking communion. Some taught that a man and wife should not have sex when they have a child that has not yet been weaned. In other words, when the woman is still nursing. And some taught that it was a grave sin, a very serious sin, to not do it in the man on top position, what's often called the missionary position. Another aspect of this tradition were elaborate prohibitions on incest. Incest is sex with family members. It, of course, includes your immediate family members. That's forbidden in almost all cultures and societies and religions. But in many contexts, including in Judaism, it's common to marry a first cousin. That was forbidden. Sometimes even marrying a second or third cousin was forbidden. It got to the point where it was difficult to keep track of and then difficult to prevent, quote, incest in smaller communities of people. Now, much of this would strike most present-day Christians, whether Catholic or Protestant or Eastern Orthodox, as really extreme. And so it is. And in the course of the 20th century, Roman Catholic tradition mellowed quite a bit. Again, theologian Uta Ranke Heinemann says, quote, "Current Catholic teaching holds that in the marital act, the motives, with procreation at their head, no longer need be given so much thought. What's important is rather that nothing be done to check the course of the conjugal act as laid down by nature. That would be against nature and a serious sin. In other words, thou shalt not practice contraception. One need not be constantly thinking of a child so long as one doesn't exclude the possibility." End quote. The natural end, then, of sex is viewed as producing offspring. As long as you don't deliberately stop that, then the view is now it's okay to engage in sex for the purpose of pleasure. Early Protestants were still influenced by this Hellenized view, but Protestantism has tended to go back to the biblical type of view, and this is probably what's going on in moderating the tradition in Roman Catholicism in recent times as well. The third outlook on human sexuality in the Christian tradition is what I call liberationist ethics, and this really has only existed since the 1970s in the Christian tradition. I call it liberationist because the assumption is that the main problem with people's sex lives is that they're unable to do what they really want to do. They're too restricted by society and by traditions and by what other people want, and people need to be set free to do what they really want. This is a very permissive outlook. It holds that any sex is permissible so long as both parties give valid consent and no one is seriously harmed. And presumably you can't give consent if you're a kid, so that rules out sex with minors. But a lot of things would be permitted on this type of sexual ethics that wouldn't be permitted in any more traditional Christian view. Things like gay sex, sex before marriage or sex outside of marriage, recreational sex between people who are not married, polyamory, and other things. This is a type of outlook you would find within liberal Christianity today. In our next segment, Christian prayer and worship.